Good morning and welcome to the Economic and Finance Standing Policy Committee for November 26th. And we're going to continue on till tomorrow. So it'll be for today and tomorrow. I'll start off with the acknowledgement statement. The City of Lethbridge acknowledges that we're gathered on the lands of the Blackfoot people of the Canadian Plains and pays respect to the Blackfoot people past, present, and future, while recognizing and respecting their cultural heritage, beliefs, and relationship to the land. The City of Lethbridge offers respect to the Métis and all who have lived on this land and made Lethbridge their home. So if you could do a roll call, Madam City Clerk.
Thank you, Mayor Higgin. Councillor Campbell?
Present.
Councillor Croson?
Present.
Councillor Dodick?
I am here.
Councillor Middleton Hope has taken a leave, so he's not with us. Councillor Parker? Here. Vice Chair Schmidt-Rempel?
Here.
Acting Mayor Carlson?
Hello.
Deputy Mayor Palladino?
Present.
And Mayor Higgin.
Present.
Thank you.
Right. And I have a resolution for the adoption of the agenda. Be it resolved that the November 26, 2024 agenda of the Economic and Finance Standing Policy Committee meeting be adopted as presented from Councillor Croson. Are there any additions, Madam City Clerk?
Thank you, Mayor Higgin. There's one addition currently, and it is Deloitte's briefing that they will be presenting shortly. So we have that ready to put into the public web and to distribute to council. It's about a 32-page presentation.
All right, so we need about 5 minutes to get that uploaded then?
Yeah,
All right.
so after council amends the agenda and adopts it, we will do that.
All right, Councillor Croson. Oh.
Question.
The question's been called. All in favor? And that passes. So we'll just take a few minutes here to get that uploaded.
Thank you.
All right, that has been updated to the public, and so we'd like to, I have a resolution here, consent agenda from Deputy Mayor Palladino. Be it resolved that the Economic and Finance Standing Policy Committee, number 1, approve the minutes of the Economic and Finance Standing Policy Committee meeting held on November 13th, 2024, and authorize the mayor and the city clerk to sign the same. And number 2, receive the information, the status of initiatives for November 26, 2024. Councillor Palladino.
Changes or additions
I can't get them.
Are there no changes to the agenda?
This
it's
is
just
consent.
consent.
We've
Okay,
done
it's
the
just consent.
agenda, so
Okay.
we're just good to go on the
Okay.
consent for a motion. Thank you.
Okay, call for the vote.
Question been called. All in favor? Thank you. That's unanimous. Thank you. Next, we have some presentations, and I just want to start off by mentioning that these presentations will, a lot of the questions that I'm sure myself and my colleagues will have around the horseshoe will be answered throughout the presentation. So I would ask that any questions, jot them down, and when the presentation is done, we can ask the questions at that time. Also, we want to make sure the public has the opportunity to speak to any questions that they may have, and that will be happening tomorrow. So just so we can start with that, hold the questions off till later, and as well as the public being able to speak tomorrow. With that, I'll turn the time over to Mr. City Manager to introduce our presenters.
Thank you, members of Economics Finance SPC, for having us here today. As was noted by the Mayor earlier this morning, we're going to be going through Deloitte's council briefing on Phase 1 of the LD third-party review relating to the Agri-Food Hub and Trade Centre project this morning. Tomorrow, we'll go through a presentation on the recommendations within the report relating to the City of Lethbridge and the financial impacts for our community. I would like to introduce now Darren Livingnick and Chris Chandro, who will be presenting the Lethbridge and District Exhibition, Phase 1 and third-party review.
Thank you, CFO Matthews. As mentioned, City Administration had engaged our firm, Deloitte, to complete a third-party review of Lethbridge and District Exhibition. Today, we will present a summary of findings and recommendations from our work to date. My name is Darren Livingnick. I'm a partner responsible for this engagement. I'm joined by Chris Chandro, who was the project manager for our team. We were supported by more than 10 professionals, including experts in auditing, construction management, engineering, forensic accounting, and financial management. Your first question is likely about our qualifications to carry out this review. My focus is on reviewing the compliance, performance, and value for money of government-funded activities and programs. I have completed numerous similar reviews for municipal and provincial governments across Canada. I have significant experience with the subject matter in question. I started my career auditing construction contracts. I have prepared business plans and feasibility studies for similar developments. But most importantly, I have extensive experience working with regional agricultural societies across Alberta. Our team has in the past completed similar reviews for the agricultural societies in Edmonton and Red Deer when they experienced similar financial difficulties, which means we have now reviewed 3 of the 4 largest agricultural societies in this province. Through these projects, we have also researched the practices from a governance and operations perspective that make these organizations successful across Alberta, across Canada, and internationally. Put simply, I can say with confidence that I'm the most qualified person to lead a review of this type in Alberta. And I'm supported by a team that has all of the competence needed to complete this work effectively. And through this work, we have also developed a strong appreciation for the important role that these agricultural societies play in bringing our communities together across this province. This was a thorough review. Over the past 6 months, our work consisted of interviews with LDE employees, city administration, as well as select third-party vendors that had worked with LDE over this time period. We reviewed background documents and financial information, including budgets, financial statements, strategic plans, policies, procedures, transaction records, meeting minutes, meeting transcripts, and more. Hundreds of documents representing thousands of pages of information. We considered the practices that are in place in similar organizations across this province and leading organizations around the world. And we evaluated the design and implementation of certain internal controls to support the effective governance and financial management of this organization. Through this, we identified a number of findings and we developed a number of recommendations, which, to the extent possible, we validated with members of LDE management, city administration, and we present those to you today. Before we continue, I would like to express our thanks to city administration and the current management team at LDE for their cooperation throughout this process. Our work dated back to as early as 2013, and I know it's not an easy task to track down hundreds of requests dating back over that 12-year period. Both teams have been extremely proactive, responsive, and helpful to us throughout this process in allowing us to conduct our work. Our presentation today covers 3 pieces, and it's intended to provide council, administration, as well as concerned citizens and other stakeholders with more information on what our review found around the circumstances that led to the current financial difficulties at LDE, our assessment of the current state of governance and operations at LDE at the time that the city assumed control, and our recommendations for how to improve the financial sustainability of this organization going forward. Before reviewing the findings and recommendations, I would like to take a moment to provide important context on our scope on the next slide. Our work primarily focused on the planning, development, and operations of the new Agri-Food Hub and Trade Center development. We recognize that in parallel, the city was undertaking additional analysis around other topics such as the legacy pavilions. We have in some cases considered relevant findings from their analysis and incorporated into our overall conclusions. Throughout our report and throughout our presentation today, we make reference to common and leading practices of similar organizations. This is based on research that we've done into the comparable agricultural societies across the province, as well as similar societies other places in North America and internationally. And finally, just considering the good practices that we would expect of any nonprofit that is receiving a significant amount of public funding. This work was not without challenges. Given the time period that we were looking at, access to information was a challenge at times, as was access to third-party personnel who in some cases are no longer involved in the organization. And while we interviewed certain former vendors, we did not talk to every single person who was involved in the operations and governance of LDE prior to the changeover. There also were challenges where decisions were not documented or documents were not retained. Where that was the case, we did our best to corroborate and verify the information we had with multiple sources before considering it in our findings. I note that our report has been prepared at the request of the city. Our procedures were designed to meet the goals of city administration and council. In doing so, other people who read this report should not place reliance on it without considering that. I'm now going to ask my colleague Chris to provide some background information on LDE for everybody who's watching today.
Thanks, Darren. As Darren noted, I will now take us through the background of LDE. Founded in 1897 by local ranchers and community members, LDE has operated for more than 127 years as a nonprofit agricultural society governed by elected community members. From 1912 to 1999, LDE continued to expand its footprint and community impact through the development of the Grandstand, Heritage Hall, and the pavilions. In 2013, a pivotal year in LDE's history, the organization started planning for the Agri-Food Hub and Trade Centre, which the City and Government of Alberta would eventually fund for $70.6 million. Construction commenced in 2021, and the building officially opened to the public in August 2023. By November 2023, LDE was experiencing significant financial difficulties and sought emergency funding from Lethbridge City Council. Council agreed to provide the funding, contingent on several changes to the agreement between the City and LDE. As a result, a Memorandum of Understanding was signed in 2024, leading to the City taking ownership of all LDE shares and replacing the LDE board with City and County administration. As the current sole shareholder of LDE, the City has assumed responsibility for stabilizing LDE's governance, operations, and finances. City administration has since appointed Deloitte to perform a third-party review to evaluate the current state of LDE, understand what actions led to the current situation, identify improvement opportunities, and provide recommendations for the City's consideration as they seek to enhance the future financial sustainability of LDE. Next slide. In terms of their structure, LDE is an agricultural society incorporated under the Agricultural Societies Act of Alberta. Agricultural societies are nonprofits that encourage improvement in agriculture and quality of life through programs, events, services, and facilities that meet community needs. LDE is currently classified as a regional agricultural society and receives approximately $400,000 of annual funding from the Ministry of Agriculture and Irrigation. In terms of their governance, agricultural societies are governed by a board of directors elected by shareholders. Prior to the Memorandum of Understanding, the LDE board was intended to be comprised of up to 12 shareholders and one representative each from the City and Lethbridge County. Following the Memorandum of Understanding, the LDE board now consists of 5 representatives from the City and 2 representatives from Lethbridge County. In terms of their vision and mission, LDE's vision is to be welcoming and impactful hosts that deliver vibrant opportunity and best-in-class results. Their mission is to be the premier destination, excelling in the experience of bringing people together from all over the world and accelerating economic opportunity through the delivery of memorable experiences. To deliver on their vision and mission, LDE effectively fulfills 3 functions: event attractor, event manager, and facility manager. Next slide. In terms of their facility, LDE currently operates and maintains one of the largest usable event hosting spaces in Alberta, outside of Edmonton and Calgary. With over 260,000 square feet, the Agri-Food Hub is a new, purpose-built facility that is designed to host events of all sizes, from intimate meetings to large-scale conventions and trade shows. In addition to the Agri-Food Hub, LDE continues to maintain several older buildings, including the Heritage Hall and the pavilions. These buildings are not in good condition and are not actively marketed to the public at this time. Further, LDE anticipates spending around $500,000 per year to maintain these buildings on an ongoing basis. The Agri-Food Hub and the older buildings are managed by the team from LDE. However, LDE does not have the internal capabilities required to manage and maintain these facilities, resulting in a reliance on third-party service providers. Next slide. As can be seen in the table here, LDE is one of the largest agricultural societies in Alberta. With the Agri-Food Hub and the older buildings, LDE maintains and operates over 385,000 square feet of indoor event space, which is larger than the Regional Agricultural Society in Red Deer and significantly larger than other regional agricultural societies in Alberta. I will now pass it off to Darren to go through findings of our retrospective review.
So the first phase of this work, the retrospective review, was focused on what circumstances, what actions and decisions led to the financial difficulties that were experienced. The first area of findings was around strategic planning done to initiate the development of this project. And ultimately, we found that the strategic planning activities undertaken were not sufficient to support the investment made in LDE. The success of any major capital project and business expansion depends on thorough planning, thinking through the development of a long-term business plan that outlines our goals, our objectives, identifies the actions required to achieve them, acknowledges the measures used to evaluate them, and also considers the steps and the investments that we need to make to be successful. We all know the adage, measure twice, cut once. These plans, however, should be refined throughout the project life cycle to reflect new information and decisions. This ensures that the project team and stakeholders are aligned on expectations around the shared objectives, requirements for success, and next steps. This also ensures that the capital investment dollars allocated can be demonstrated to achieve the stated objectives, but can also both be seen as feasible and value for money. When we look at our findings on whole, LDE management did not sufficiently plan for all aspects of the Agri-Food Hub and Trade Center and did not take appropriate steps to assess and consider changes throughout the project lifecycle. Some examples of these findings include when we look at the strategic plans and we see that targets used to support the funding of the Agri-Food Hub project were not aligned with the historical results of LDE, comparable organizations, or other reasonable third-party support. We also found that many of the strategic plans contemplated by LDE were not supported by actionable operational plans. There were instances where those targets were contradictory or inconsistent throughout documentation we obtained. Strategic plans were not updated as circumstances changed, despite significant changes in the environment, including most notably the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, and many revenue streams that were included in their original analysis were never realized in terms of the operationalization of this business plan. To give an example or to provide some context, if we're developing a significantly larger facility, for us to be successful, that means we have to go out and attract more events. So you think about the steps that you would logically make to expand your marketing function, to put in new processes, systems, and policies to set you up for success in achieving those targets. Those are the types of operational plans that weren't consistently put in place to make sure that those plans could be realized. The second area is around facilities planning in general and the concept of asset management. Think about these capital investments that have been made as significant assets that this organization is responsible to steward and safeguard. But they also come with significant costs over their lives. So what we found was that facility maintenance records and logs were not retained for either the Agri-Food Hub or the existing LDE buildings and pavilions. The facility maintenance practices in general were not sufficient to maximize the useful life and address health and safety concerns for the older buildings, and not to the level of the common practices that we would see in a similar organization. And finally, there was a lack of capital reserve funding set aside for future maintenance needs. If you step back, many of us have been through the process of purchasing a condo. You look at that condo and you look at the reserve fund study that outlines an engineer's view of the future expenses that we're going to have to be able to maintain this asset over this life. LDE appears to have not had either visibility into the future, what those future costs were going to be, and they weren't setting aside the funds needed to be able to support them in the future. And what we see later in our presentation is that significant costs were coming to be determined. And finally, when we look at some of the financial models and forecasts, we see that reasonably expected increases in future operating costs associated with this larger facility coming online were not fully incorporated into the models used to assess feasibility. The second area of findings is around the delivery of the capital project itself. And we found in general that the capital project delivery and execution did not align with the common practices that we would see for a project of this size. The successful delivery and execution of large-scale capital projects depends on effective design and construction management processes. These processes should be aligned with established project plans, documented policies and procedures, and common practices that we would expect in any project of this size. These practices ensure that projects are delivered on time, on budget, and with reduced risk for the end customer. Based on our findings, the project delivery and execution to construct the Agri-Food Hub was in many instances not aligned with policies, procedures, and practices that we would expect LDE management to have followed, given the size of the project. For example, we would have noted that on project initiation, there was no charter prepared or approved. To put this in perspective, I'm a certified project management professional, and the very first step of every major project should be developing that charter so that all stakeholders are aligned on the expectations for the project and what needs to happen for us to be successful. Steps like that were not taken. Throughout contracting, we found that alternative construction delivery mechanisms were not considered. The type of construction contract that was entered into is a form that puts significant risk and responsibility on the owner, in this case LDE, to effectively manage the integration between design and the general contractor at the end of the day. Our view, based on our expertise in the area of construction management, was that there were other types of construction contracts that should have been used given the nature of LDE and the level of subject matter expertise that it had internally that would have reduced the risk in end-to-end delivery of that project, would have reduced the risk of any future cost or schedule overruns or scope changes. Most notably, we found a number of issues around procurements. First, procurement policies for LDE itself were not sufficiently detailed and precise to give the LDE employees the guidance they needed to achieve desired results. However, we also found that there was a lack of formal procurement processes surrounding the architect/designer and project manager who were procured through sole source contracts, with the earliest contract dating back to 2013. We also found that the procurement processes for the construction manager, which was the largest portion of this project, was not aligned with some of the common practices that we would expect, and in some cases, LDE policies were not followed. This includes undisclosed changes to the evaluation criteria that potentially disadvantaged higher ranking procurements or proponents during the award of that contract. We also found, in general, that through reviews of project budgets and forecasts, the information that was presented was inconsistent and lacking in detail that individuals may have needed to ask the right questions and to provide the right oversight of some of those processes. Initial estimates for the parking lot refurbishment and pavilion demolition were not supported by third-party quotes or appropriate due diligence, and later were found to have been significantly underestimated. Change orders often lacked detail or included missing or delayed approvals. And while functionality changed significantly compared to the initial development plan, there wasn't sufficient analysis or consideration to support some of those decisions. I would like to note that while the LDE procurement processes observed were not consistent with what we expect, we did not observe any inappropriate behavior on the part of vendors that were involved in the process. The third area of findings was around the governance of the organization. And effectively, we found that the government structures were not in place to provide oversight throughout this development and through overall operation of this entity. Successful organizations will have strong governance structures in place to provide oversight of and create accountability surrounding key organizational activities and risks. Key elements that should be in place include a clear organizational structure with defined roles and responsibilities, a robust system of policies and procedures covering areas such as financial management and compliance, and a strong governing body to provide strategic direction and oversight. LDE's previous board governance model delegated many operational responsibilities to the CEO. Board policies were designed to define boundaries within which the CEO and the staff were to operate. But based on our findings, there were many instances where the board did not provide effective oversight to identify and resolve potential issues with this development. Our findings also included instances of non-compliance with LDE's own internal policies by the board of directors, the audit committee, and the CEO. The impact that these deficiencies had on decisions made during planning and construction of the Agri-Food Hub cannot be quantified. However, the lack of effective governance processes during planning and construction could have allowed certain actions and decisions that were not well supported to progress without accountability, which ultimately contributed to the current financial position of LDE. Some examples of specific findings we identified were that there were gaps in the board composition that hampered oversight given the significant complexity of the developments that LDE was undertaken. That board recruitment processes for this and many other regional agricultural societies do not always consistently achieve desired results in terms of consistently bringing the competencies, experiences, and expertise needed to manage projects of this size and complexity. There was a time period where the city's representative was withdrawn from the LDE board, which was during a critical period of decision-making around the Agri-Food Hub, which reduced transparency and accountability. And there was a lack of documented approval of certain functional design changes that were made over the 7-year process that this development was being considered. In terms of some day-to-day activities, we found that there were many concerns around the review and approval of expenses throughout the organization. The CEO's expenses were submitted without appropriate forms, supporting evidence, or appropriate approvals. Board expenses were not supported in accordance with their own policies. And expenses for a specific grant-funded advocacy trip were not supported by appropriate documentation or assessment of the return on investment. In terms of policy compliance, we noted that there were gaps in the board's compliance with key policies, including their process for evaluation of CEO compensation, monitoring of CEO performance, and annual evaluation processes. There were also gaps in the audit committee's compliance with policies to monitor CEO expenses and CEO compliance with financial policies. And finally, there were gaps in compliance with policies for capital and operational planning, financial reporting and decisions, asset protection, and communication and reporting obligations. Put collectively, there was a lack of accountability and oversight that potentially allowed some of these actions and decisions to go on throughout this period. The fourth area of findings is around the use of funds and the value for money received. And ultimately, we found that LDE incurred many expenses that were either not allowable under policies or not what a reasonable person would consider good value. Those charged with governance and management of a nonprofit organization, such as LDE, need to maintain financial discipline to ensure long-term sustainability. This is crucial because of the ongoing reliance that organizations like LDE have on grant funding from governments and donations from private citizens. Because of these dynamics, organizations like LDE have a very high bar to meet in terms of respect for public trust and maintaining the trust of those stakeholders. Strong financial management practices are foundational to maintaining that trust. Based on our findings, there were many instances where spending did not comply with internal LDE policies or common practices. These instances included examples where expenditures were either not allowed under a policy or appropriate documentation was not submitted and retained. These instances also included examples where a reasonable person could consider the expenses to be either lavish or poor value when considering the objectives of the organization. Further, as I mentioned in the governance section, there were clear gaps in the processes to monitor expenses, which contributed to this pattern of spending. The pattern of spending did have a significant impact on LDE, as each incremental expenditure would have contributed to the overarching financial challenges during a time where fiscal restraint was very much needed. And while LDE policies were not consistently followed, I do know that, again, we did not observe any evidence of inappropriate behavior on the part of vendors that were involved in these processes. So just to highlight some of the specific findings, we did test a sample of expenses submitted by both the CEO and board members as well. The expenses with the CEO, 35 out of the 35 were not compliant with the LDE policies in place for various reasons. That could be because no form was submitted, no supporting documentation was submitted, or there was no evidence to support that there was a valid business purpose. Some of these purchases did include items such as alcohol at private events, car washes, televisions, and other electronics that were purchased for various reasons. We also tested a number of expenses made by board members, which again we found were not consistently reviewed in accordance with the policy set out. These again included purchases such as alcohol at private events, catering for events, and tickets for events. And of these, 50% of them we found were not compliant with the policies that were set in place. We did test a number of change orders related to the construction project. Of those, we found that 5 out of 14 were non-compliant with LDE's own policies, including examples where change orders were not signed or were not signed in a timely manner. And we did identify approximately $657,000 in cost overruns that were related to design issues and changes. We cannot state with certainty that those would have been avoided if some of the practices around construction management were better. But again, they point to a pattern of activities that contributed to the financial situation. Some examples of those are that more than $330,000 was spent on high-grade reclaimed wood, furniture, and fixtures made using trees cleared from the LDE site. Approximately $300,000 was spent to close off a space that was originally intended to be a quick-serve restaurant that couldn't be realized due to design issues. and more than $30,000 was spent to address ventilation issues with the design of the server room. I will caveat that when we look at the overall construction cost per square foot of the development, it is reasonable. But again, we've identified many specific examples where incremental costs could have been taken out of the development. And finally, our final area of findings is the way in which the plans and studies were presented to City Council throughout this process, and as requests were made for additional funding. So over the time period from 2013 to 2020, there were many presentations in front of City Council where LDE leadership presented with their requests for funding. The purpose of these was often to share plans for the development, to share some of their financial forecasts and models, and to give council the information that was needed to approve those funding decisions. What we found is that those presentations were not clear and consistent throughout for various reasons. On numerous occasions, LDE management had referenced the work of a third party. They referenced the work of a third party that was done to support their own analysis of the project plans and developments. And on numerous occasions, that work was referenced, but it was referenced without critical context on the scope, assumptions, and restrictions of use of that work. Based on review of the transcripts and the videos of those open and closed sessions, it is apparent to us that City Council was not fully aware of the restrictions on that use, on that work, and what that meant in terms of Council's ability to rely on those presentations made. We also could not verify that City Council or administration had received supporting analysis for those presentations that was requested during some of those meetings prior to making a decision to approve funding. We could also not validate that LDE management had appropriate qualifications or undertook appropriate steps to review and take ownership of the work of the third party. To provide some context on that, when the third party performed their work, there would have been assumptions that they made, and there would have been limitations on the use of that work. And as part of their responsibilities, LDE management had to review and take ownership and make sure they were comfortable with the way that work was presented. And we cannot verify that appropriate steps were taken to challenge that work and to make sure that they were fully comfortable with the information that was presented. We also could not find or verify at the time that City Council or administration had undertaken sufficient due diligence of their own around some of the work performed and some of the presentations made to take ownership of the same. Going back to some of the presentations that were made over time, we did note that they were inconsistent in format and structure of financial information that was communicated to council, which would have contributed to confusion around the overall project scope and cost. Questions like what was included or not included in both the functional use of the development and what was included or not included in the cost estimates put forward. We also found that while not included in the scope of the original CIP submissions, LDE did not proactively communicate when it became known that there would be significant additional costs associated with demolition and parking refurbishment that were not planned for as part of this development. These costs were later uncovered by the city, but despite the significant unanticipated cost, it wasn't known until the city became involved in day-to-day operations. And there are indications that the initial project budgets significantly underestimated the costs of the pavilion demolition and parking lot refurbishment due to a lack of due diligence. So we have identified a number of findings and recommendations related to this and opportunities to learn from this experience and improve policies and processes to better address issues like this that arise in the future. But there are many items for discussion on this file. So with that said, I'm going to pass it to my colleague Chris, who's going to go through an assessment.
Sorry, I'm just to interrupt here. We thought that would be a good time to do a break here. We do have, there'll be a lot of questions we thought up to this point here. Excuse me. If we can just put a few questions. If they're going to be answered later, please let us know, but we'll turn over for some questions if that's all right. And we'll start off with my fella to the left here, Mr. Dodick. Councillor Dodick, floor is yours.
The way I look at what's happened with the exhibition, it's really broken down into time schedules. And that is the point in time that basically ended up at the meetings of August 10 and August 24 when the project was approved and the city had agreed to fund as well as backstopping a loan. So I see that as a separate point. So if the answer at that point in time was no funding, we would not see us here today because the exhibition in its present iteration would not have been built. And you had indicated that you had reviewed what had gone on in terms of the funding. So I take it you would have reviewed the August 10th and August 24 meetings. They were on the website. So you reviewed those? Okay, I see you nodding your head. I just want to make sure that...
Yes, we reviewed every single meeting, open and closed, that related to this project over that time period.
Okay, and so there were also there was a relatively short presentation on August 10, 2020 by the Mr. Workenden at that time and I don't know what they call him, the president of the Lethbridge District Exhibition, and as well at that point in time was adjourned for 2 weeks to allow, as the council was calling it, as a soak time. So here's where I have my concerns, and in terms of, I'm aware that the Lethbridge District and Exhibition made errors or assumptions and things of that nature. But you had, in your summary of findings, council communications, at one point you say, 5.1.2, we could not verify that city council or administration received supporting analysis requested. Now, I have tried to obtain what you have so called third party, but there's no problem naming the third party because on the August 10th meeting, I think it was Mr. Woodman appeared on behalf of Myers Norris Penny, so it's a public record. I have tried to get a copy of that Myers Norris Penny record, and the way the questions were posed, and there were very few questions posed to the third party, one of which dealt with, are you basically satisfied with the assumptions provided to you? And Mr. Woodman, or Woodward, or whoever it was, had indicated that he was. So that's a fairly long preface to my question, but maybe it's my legal background, and that is, I'm aware of the existence of a report. The report is being at least alluded to. Should not council and or both administration requested a copy of the report prior to entering into a decision of such a huge impact to the community?
Yeah, through the chair. Fair question, Councillor. I look at this from a couple perspectives. So to clarify, for avoidance of doubt, there were underlying reports prepared by the third party. We have had an opportunity to review some of those reports that were made available to us. Our understanding is that City Council and administration at the time prior to the decision had not received all of that information. That was requested of LDE at some of those meetings that you're alluding to in your question, but it wasn't followed up on. Those reports in some cases include details on assumptions. They also include context on the actual scope of the work, limitations on that work, and the restrictions on reliance on that work. And so based on that, council didn't necessarily have a whole view of what was put forward. So as to your question of what should that process have looked like, given that a third party was retained on behalf of the group receiving funding, I do think it was a good practice would be for administration and council to be challenging that work, to be doing their own due diligence, receiving in some cases that detailed work so that they can review the findings, the assumptions, the conclusions, and ask their own questions to make sure it's suitable from the city's perspective and for the city's perspective, or for the city's purposes. So I think in this case, council rightly asked the questions. It did approve without receiving the information requested, and there were opportunities to improve the policies or processes from a city perspective around how administration and council can deal with these kind of funding requests in the future.
But best practices would have been on insisting on providing the material that it was being relied on by the Lethbridge District Exhibition to make the suggestion that they were making a pot of money beyond the $400,000 a year net income that they were making previously, and now all of a sudden they're selling this pot of gold. So the short answer, the short question is, we should have insisted on that, should we not?
We should have insisted on doing the work we needed to do to be satisfied. I use the we on behalf of council and administration.
Okay, so that's item 5.1.4, which is on page 14 of your report. I'm assuming that means exactly that. We could not validate that City Council or administration at the time undertook sufficient due diligence procedures to validate the work undertaken by LDE.
That's correct. Okay. So we've provided recommendations on how to strengthen the processes around that in the future.
Again, hearkening back to legal background, litigation background, expert report on one side says ABC. You rely on that, and it turns out that expert DEF, who might have greater competence or expertise, comes to a different conclusion. So in the context of what we're talking about here, had we been given the Myers-Norris Penny report, to the extent the report existed, would you not feel it would have been due diligence also to obtain a report, to review that report, to either see, yes, it comports with what the conclusions reached? Would that be a best practice too?
Yeah, I would say in practice, you could see this addressed in one of two ways, and it likely depends on the size of the project and also the level of expertise available within administration and council to assess.
Okay.
So in some cases, yes, let's request the information, review it ourselves, come to our own conclusions, and ask our own questions to challenge it to make sure it's fit for our own purpose. Or in some cases, especially around major projects that are funded, sometimes you'll see experts retained on both sides to come to independent conclusions around those type of things. I would just hearken back to the second presentation, or the second slide of our presentation. We clarified some of the scope and restrictions on the use of our report. Our work was done on behalf, we were engaged by the city. We did our work to meet the needs of the city. And so understanding that when a third party firm is involved, that doesn't necessarily mean they're working for you, or that their reports were intended to meet your needs.
No, I understand that. I was just, because I wanted to make sure, I wanted to start questioning here because you're going to be talking going forward as to what has happened since the funding has occurred. So I want to know what we as council could do on a go-forward basis. When you were talking a $70 million plus dollar budget, we have to act differently than when we're approving a baseball diamond and spending $5,000. If I hear you correctly, that's basically what you're saying is you got to look at it in the context of the size of the project.
That's right. And just to add, I would encourage not dealing with this on a case-by-case basis and developing a bit of a policy framework to say, hey, for projects of this size where funding is requested, these are the things we're going to look for at minimum. For projects of this size, we're going to look at more and approaching it in a risk-based way.
Just out of curiosity, did you ever see a report prepared by MNP in relation to this project?
We were able to review numerous reports and working papers related to this project.
Okay. I know I haven't been able to. I'm just not sure if the rest of council has. And I'm going to postpone any further questions, but I thank you for that, gentlemen. I understand how reports work. There's usually a qualification in there that a lot of times they say the information provided to us, or we're basing our report on the information provided to us, and we have not done an extensive review as to whether that information is accurate or not. And I've seen that in many reports. Is that a usual in a report that's trying to forward look and try to guess as to what the future may hold in terms of income and expenses?
Yeah, it would be very common in practice. The future is always difficult to forecast, and forecasts are just that. They're predictions based on assumptions, right? And so the key from my perspective as somebody who is a CPA and has spent years of his career looking at projects of this nature is it's not actually about what the forecast says, it's about what the assumptions that underpinned it were and how comfortable are you that those assumptions are achievable. And so ultimately understanding, you know, that context, what were the inputs, what was the thought process to develop those assumptions becomes really important.
Okay. And and actually this is my final questions. Would you agree with me that in general terms that lawyers are more interesting and entertaining than our accountants?
They do ask tougher questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions, colleagues? I see none, so I'm going to continue on with the current state. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I will now take us through the assessment we performed over the current state of LDE's governance and operations. Our assessment of LDE's governance and operations considered all relevant aspects of a successful agricultural society. Can you hear me better now? Perfect. Our assessment of LDE's governance and operations considered all relevant aspects of a successful agricultural society, including revenue and profitability, cost and financial management, governance and strategy, and more. Our view of what makes an organization successful is based on extensive leading practice research on Alberta's agricultural societies and leading event and trade show operators. We have considered our findings in the context of this research to assess a rating between 1 and 4, with a 1 meaning that the function mildly enables the achievement of LDE's objectives, and a 4 meaning that the function fully enables the achievement of LDE's objectives. This rating is intended to provide a snapshot of the current maturity of LDE's functions compared to leading organizations. We would not expect an organization to be mature in all functions. However, it is critical that organizations identify the functions most important to them and try to excel at that. Based on the evaluation performed, we found that the governance and operational practices employed by LDE are immature compared to similar and leading organizations. In other words, there are many opportunities to increase the financial sustainability of LDE by enhancing the operational and governance policies, procedures, and systems. I will now take us through the findings for each of the evaluation criteria. For revenue and profitability, we find that this function mildly enables the achievement of LDE's objectives. First, LDE generates substantially lower external revenues per square foot compared to their peers, with $11 of external revenue per square foot compared to an average of $44 per square foot for their peers. Second, LDE is increasingly reliant on government grants and contributions for funding compared to external revenue sources, which can be seen through a 39% cumulative annual growth rate for government grants and contributions compared to a negative 6% growth rate for external revenues. Third, LDE employs basic processes to monitor event utilization and event profitability, limiting their ability to make more deliberate decisions around event attraction and the mix of events. For cost and financial management, we find that this function mildly enables the achievement of LDE's objectives. While operating expenses have grown approximately 10% per year over the last 5 years, LDE's procurement and vendor management policies are insufficiently detailed to guide employees and achieve value for money. For example, LDE policy requires that comparative bids, or prices and quality, are obtained for asset purchases over $5K, and a stringent method is followed to assure quality and cost for asset purchases over $20K. However, LDE policy does not define the number of comparative bids that should be obtained or the criteria that should be used to evaluate quality and cost. Further, LDE's planning, budgeting, and reporting processes are insufficiently detailed and inconsistently applied year over year, reducing accountability and value for money. For example, from 2019 to 2023, LDE used 3 different methods to prepare their budgets, which creates confusion and makes it difficult to compare budgets year over year. For facilities and site management, we find that this function mildly enables the achievement of LDE's objectives. First, given the diverse expertise and skills required to maintain complex facilities like the Agri-Food Hub, LDE is heavily reliant on third-party service providers that are engaged at a premium price. Second, LDE does not currently and has not historically retained facility maintenance records for the Agri-Food Hub and the older buildings, which makes it difficult to determine the level of maintenance work that has been completed. Finally, even though required by LDE policy, LDE does not have a sufficient capital reserve fund in place to pay for future capital requirements and deferred maintenance costs. For sales and marketing, we find that this function mildly enables the achievement of LDE objectives. First, even though facility square footage increased by 110% with the development of the Agri-Food Hub, LDE did not scale up the size of their sales and marketing function prior to the recent change in leadership and governance. For example, LDE only employed one full-time event sales employee at the time of the change. Second, prior to the recent change in leadership and governance, LDE did not have a sufficiently detailed sales plan or other infrastructure to support a proactive business development strategy, hurting their ability to attract events. Finally, LDE does not have a formally defined event strategy to provide clarity around the nature and size of events that LDE wants to attract and host. For governance, we find that this function mildly enables the achievement of LDE's objectives. Prior to the recent change in governance, the LDE Board of Directors did not have sufficient experience with the core functions of LDE, including event management and event attraction, hurting their ability to provide effective oversight. Second, the historical process to elect directors from the existing pool of shareholders has created challenges due to the inconsistency in the qualifications of candidates year over year. Finally, it is important to note that without returning to the historical member-based governance structure in the future, which is a requirement of the Agricultural Societies Act, LDE is at risk of losing critical provincial grant funding. For strategy, we find that this function moderately enables the achievement of LDE's objectives. First, while LDE is in the process of preparing one, the organization has not created a new strategic plan since 2020, which is critical to ensure that LDE's strategy remains relevant and is aligned with their current priorities and the business environment. Second, even though LDE has partnered with many organizations in Lethbridge, LDE does not have a formal policy or process to consistently manage partnerships and ensure they are beneficial for LDE. Finally, it's important to note that there is overlap in LDE's functions with other regional organizations, presenting an opportunity for LDE to partner with these organizations to provide better quality services at lower costs. This is something we will touch on later on. For community and regional impact, we find that this function moderately enables the achievement of LDE's objectives. LDE is a long-standing contributor to the Lethbridge community and hosts several notable community events, such as Whoop Up Days and the LDE Lotteries program, with the latter supporting deserving local organizations. However, we note that many of LDE's activities and events do not align with their mandate as an agricultural society, and in some cases overlaps with municipal priorities and services. Finally, while management is intending to develop one in the future, LDE does not have a formal policy with respect to community engagement, potentially hampering their ability to engage with and provide meaningful benefits to the community. Finally, for people and culture, we find that this function moderately enables the achievement of LDE's objectives. LDE employs over 35 full-time employees and benefited from more than 3,000 volunteer hours. In the most recent year, these statistics were tracked, which is a significant achievement. While recent years have been challenging from an employer perspective, including temporary layoffs due to COVID-19 and financial uncertainties, current LDE management is actively working to improve the employee experience. However, we do note that management does not currently have mechanisms in place to measure volunteer satisfaction or capture volunteer feedback, which is critical to attracting new volunteers and retaining existing volunteers in the future. I will now pass it over to Darren to take us through our future state recommendations.
Thank you, Chris. When you step back, LDE is a relatively small organization when you look at it financially, but when you hear this assessment, it's actually quite complex. When you think about all the distinct functions that it has to fulfill, going out to attract events, actually managing those events day to day as they happen, and some of them are quite large and complex themselves, but then also managing this huge facility. And you look at what Chris just described, and you have an organization that is driven by the community, that is doing some aspects of this quite well, running events, engaging with the community, bringing volunteers together, but is struggling with some of the more complex aspects of this, managing the facility, having the marketing to go out and attract those events and get it utilized and to grow. And so as we looked at the assessment and we considered what the future might look like, it was with a view of how do you set this organization up for success? Now, while our work was focused on the decisions made prior to the city assuming control of LDE, we did observe through our work and through our interaction with the current LDE board and management that there has been positive progress on many of the items that were identified in our assessment of the situation at LDE. And in some cases, LDE management has planned, completed, or is in progress of working on initiatives that are in line with some of our recommendations. And some of these were, in fairness to that group, commenced prior to our discussions. So we do want to acknowledge the good work that is happening. Some examples of the positive progress include, but are not limited to, addressing some of the staffing and operational gaps to stabilize the organization, renegotiating certain problematic vendor contracts, enhancing areas such as food and beverage service, obtaining new quotations to better understand the deferred maintenance in place and other capital projects such as the parking lot refurbishment, the assessment of the legacy pavilions, and advancing initiatives to better utilize and monetize some of this revenue-generating space. It's encouraging, and the cumulative impact certainly helps to make this more stable, but it is no secret, based on these discussions, that the financial situation at LDE is still quite problematic and still requires significant investment to rectify. So this section of our report, we wanted to talk about some of the key structural changes that could be considered to help this organization be more successful and more financially viable going forward. And we'll go through those one by one. So the first question we asked is, should LDE continue to operate as an agricultural society, or should it acknowledge that it has a different mandate? So Chris had mentioned that there was a valid question in recent years as to whether enough of LDE's activities are focused on agriculture and consistent with the mandate to continue to receive provincial funding. Currently, LDE attracts a wide variety of events, and some of them are related to their purpose of promoting the agricultural sector, but many are more general purpose community events that attract and support broader community interests. So we did consider whether LDE should continue to prioritize agricultural events and activities, or if they should adopt a broader mandate that just acknowledges what their focus is and aligns that with their strategic plans going forward. We have recommended that LDE continue to prioritize agricultural events and activities. when we consider the different pros and cons of this, we still see an important role that LDE or an agricultural society in general can play in terms of maintaining connection with the broader regional community, differentiating LDE from event managers in major urban centers, and continuing to receive the provincial funding and participate in the community of practice with other agricultural societies. The second key strategic decision we analyzed is what should be the operating model for event attraction. So currently, LDE is responsible for all event attraction to utilize their facilities, including both the new agri-food trade hub and some of the previous pavilions that are still available. However, there are other organizations, including the city, that have overlapping capabilities focused on event attraction. For example, some small events will be hosted in the NMAX Center or in other venues across the city. And so we considered whether LDE should continue to have a standalone event attraction function or whether there's an opportunity to drive more synergies working together with some of these other organizations. So we considered if LDE should continue to attract all the events that leverage LDE facilities, whether the city should start to assume that event attraction activity, or whether the city should consolidate event attraction across numerous organizations in the region into a more centralized function. And ultimately, the rationale around this is that what we see in practice is that we have multiple small organizations that are going out and trying to build capabilities to market outside of Lethbridge, and in some cases, they may even be competing with each other, where there may be an event that would fit into this venue, but it goes into the wrong place ultimately because of who was doing that sales pitch. So in terms of all of these organizations independently developing the capabilities, we have recommended that the city consider establishing a new subsidiary that would consolidate some of these event attraction activities. This could potentially include capabilities that are currently within LDE and city departments, but it could also consider capabilities that are within other organizations such as Tourism Lethbridge and others. And ultimately, the goal of taking an approach like this would be to achieve some economies of scale and develop a more sophisticated and mature event attraction function with consolidated investment that would allow the group to collectively bring more events to Lethbridge to benefit the economy and the community. The third strategic decision that we considered is the model for event management. And so currently, LDE coordinates and manages all events held within their facilities. And again, there is some overlap where LDE maintains event management functions while other organizations, including the city, have their own. LDE's event management capabilities are well thought of, as we heard from Chris, and they are distinguished by their history, by their community engagement, by their regional emphasis, and the unique role they play in certain notable Lethbridge events. But there's a question, again, as to whether it makes sense to do that with more scale. So we analyzed three options. One was to continue with the status quo, where LDE and the Agricultural Society would continue to manage all events within their venues. The second was that an Agricultural Society would continue to manage all the agricultural-focused events within the facilities. And the third was that the city, again, consolidate these functions across all the facilities and create a centralized function. And so in this case, we've recommended that LDE continue to manage the signature agricultural events that they're known for, but that the city assume responsibility for community-focused events. This, again, will allow the city to bring more economies of scale and maturity of process while maintaining the unique connection that LDE has with certain broader regional stakeholders and the agricultural sector at large. And the fourth strategic decision was around the operating model for facilities management. And so currently, LDE maintains the facilities on their grounds with the exception of the Rocky Mountain Turf Club. LDE is responsible for these facilities, but as we heard in our current state assessment, they don't necessarily have the people, processes, and systems to effectively maintain this. And let's just take a step back and think about this. LDE has a small team, and they're trying to create these processes to maintain a handful of venues, whereas the city has strong, mature departments that provide the same services for over 100 unique facilities, and they do it with a high level of professionalism. So stepping back, we considered, should LDE really continue to own and maintain those facilities and develop these processes themselves? Should they continue to own the facilities but engage with the city or another party on a cost recovery basis? Or should they ultimately transfer ownership of the facilities and look to the city to assume all responsibility for maintenance? And again, the benefits of that would be that there would be access to the existing policies, processes, procedures, and resources that the city has. There would be a reduced need for the LDE board and management to have expertise in facilities maintenance and life cycle management. It would maximize the lifespan and availability of these facilities in the community. And given the significant financial investment, it would also give the city more influence to ensure that the facilities in place are used for their highest and best purpose for the community. So ultimately, we did recommend that LDE transfer ownership of facilities to the city and that the city assumes maintenance responsibilities. This is, in our view, in the best interest of the city due to the significant financial liability that the facilities represent if not properly maintained. It would ensure that these assets can be maintained and used for the best purpose and use. But we did note that this transfer should happen over time and that LDE should likely maintain ownership until 2027 at minimum to comply with the terms of provincial funding agreements in place. So under this, effectively, LDE would become a tenant of the city's property for their events. And so finally, what is the correct governance model for LDE? And so historically, LDE has been governed by a volunteer board elected by community-based shareholders. And currently, as we all are aware, LDE is governed by an appointed board that consists of representatives from the city and from Lethbridge County. There's a question as to what this should look like in the future to ensure the financial sustainability of this organization. And so we, again, considered three options. One is that the city continues to govern LDE long-term. The second is that city returns LDE governance to shareholders immediately. And the third is that the city returns LDE governance to shareholders once it is financially sustainable. We considered all of those options, but we ultimately recommended that the city should return LDE governance to the shareholders, but that should only happen once the organization is proven to be financially sustainable on an ongoing basis. At present, without another viable financing source, LDE would become insolvent in short order and would ultimately need to cease operations, which would likely result in the assets reverting back to the city as the landowner and the lessor. So ultimately, while we think the LDE plays an important role, and it's important to move back to that community governance in the long term, it is equally important for the city to continue to guide it towards a more stable position before that happens. So ultimately, what would this look like? Under the recommended approach, the city would govern LDE for 3 to 5 years until the organization is financially sustainable. Under the proposed model, LDE will continue to operate as an agricultural society, but with a more narrow focus on events that promote agricultural interests. The city will consider launching a new event attraction agency to drive community activities and benefits on a broader scale. The city will assume responsibility for the LDE facilities and provide ongoing maintenance going forward. The city will return governance of the agricultural society to the community once it is sustainable and ready to do so. And the agricultural society will become the key anchor tenant of the facilities hosted by the new event attraction agency. The proposed model is intended to provide the following benefits. It will ensure that the events LDE is known for continue to benefit Lethbridge area residents. It will allow LDE shareholders to focus on strengths in community engagement that they have proven to be good at for more than 100 years. It will maximize the lifespan, availability, and use of this beautiful new agri-food hub facility. And it will ensure that LDE will be positioned to be successful and continue to survive and contribute to Lethbridge for another 127 years. We have recommended that administration undertake further analysis on the business case, including developing a detailed implementation plan for this model before bringing any final recommendations to council to ensure that the assumptions, the forecasts have been validated, and to make sure that they're comfortable that they've come to the right conclusion around how to bring that forward. As part of our report, we've also outlined 36 recommendations to strengthen the governance of LDE and their operations to enhance financial sustainability. As we went through our work, we identified a number of recommendations and we evaluated them using different criteria around the financial impact, the implementation cost, the implementation complexity, timeline, community benefit, and reputational risk. And on that basis, we looked at each of these recommendations and sought to validate that they made sense, that they were feasible, and that they were effectively prioritized. And as we proceed to next steps, based on the recommendations, we encourage the city and LDE board and management to consider the following. First is obviously to review our report in detail, to understand the findings and recommendations, and ask any clarifying questions needed. Second is to further validate those findings and ensure they still align with stated priorities, are feasible, and do not conflict with other city initiatives that are planned. The third would be to develop a more detailed work plan to outline how LDE and city administration will work together on executing the agreed upon recommendations, including estimated timelines. And the next would be to identify the resources, internal or external, that will be potentially needed to support the city and LDE employees in executing on these, while also managing day-to-day operations. And then continuing to monitor the progress of this work as the work plan is done to ensure that the initiatives remain relevant and that any updates as circumstances evolve are promptly addressed. And finally, we encourage city administration to routinely report back to council on the progress of these initiatives. We do believe that given the nature of this challenge, that ongoing public updates and communication will continue to be critical while the city is continuing to steward this important process. Our report does include some appendix slides that include examples of some of the specific recommendations provided to LDE and city administration, but I will leave those with everyone to read and review at their own leisure. I would like to express our thanks for the opportunity to come in front of council and administration to share the findings of our report. We appreciate that LDE plays an incredibly important role in this organization and that this has been a concerning and frustrating time for both members of council, administration, and the citizens of Lethbridge as well. I hope that our presentation today was helpful in providing some more clarity and information around the circumstances that led to this and the opportunities to find a more financially sustainable path forward. Now open to taking any questions that this council may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Levinick and Mr. Chandra. Appreciate that. It's heads kind of exploding with information right now, and I can appreciate the information that was shared with us. Well, I can appreciate the information shared with us. It's not always the best information, but we might not want to hear, but it is important that we know where we stand with the Lethbridge and District Exhibition. I do have one question. I do have, there's in the queue, and to start off with, it's something that has a question has been on my mind for some time, and the different presentations that were done over the years. And one in particular, we have a very reputable city accounting firm in MNP, and as you know, there was a report that was shared by LDE that was some work that was done by MNP. And I guess I don't know if it's Mr. City Manager or designated or yourselves, through this process, was this review done by MNP? Was it done by Lethbridge District Exhibition? How, because I hear that and I get the calls and the questions of, again, I want to make sure that I state this, that it's a very reputable accounting firm. And so when information comes to us from a firm as such, my due diligence, I almost feel is done because these are experts. So I've really struggled with that one. And where that information was at all them, was there input? You know where I'm coming from, I'm hoping? Okay, thank you.
For sure. You know, what I'd say, so here's what we have been able to ascertain from the work we've done and what we've been able to review. Over the course of the 7 years from when this development started to when it was approved by council, there were several engagement points between the third-party firm and LDE management. In terms of who actually prepared the study, though, I do think there's some important context on this. So the third-party firm was engaged to do certain analysis, research, and findings. From what we were able to ascertain, they also developed a model template that was provided to LDE management. While we haven't been able to review engagement letters and things like that in detail, from the reports that we were able to review that underlie it, we were able to see that a significant amount of work was done, that some analysis was done and research on, you know, for example, comparable entities, historical analysis of what LDE financials could look like, and some of that work formed the basis for inputs into that model. But from what we see, there was also some clear assumptions around the responsibility for LDE management to review that and to take ownership of that and own the ultimate conclusion. So when you look at the council presentations that were made, everything was presented on LDE letterhead in LDE landed format, and it was primarily presented by the representatives from LDE, with the professional services firm only being there as resources, right? So there's a question around, when you look at the caveats, the assumptions, and the responsibilities, those weren't made known to this council. That's apparent from the transcripts from the meetings, that, you know, there were references made to the third-party work, but without clarifying the caveats on which you as city council should consider that work. Does that answer your
So,
question,
yeah,
Mr.
so
Mayor?
it's fair to say there's a structure and put in place, and LDE could have filled that information that would have got from this third party, populated it themselves, and brought that information to council. Is that fair to say?
That's right. So there would have been interactions throughout, but the ultimate responsibility for the final outcome likely sat with LDE management. But it doesn't appear that that was presented clearly to the council.
Okay, thank you. That does answer my question. Councillor Campbell.
Thank you. Thanks very much for the report, long awaited. I just, one thing I was wondering about in options going forward, was there ever consideration of saying, throw the keys in, we're done with the city, someone else take over? And is that even a viable thing to look at?
So it could have been considered as a viable option. What I would say is even locking the doors, there's a significant cost as administration has analyzed to be able to maintain it. If you think from a security perspective, insurance, utilities to ensure that further harm isn't caused to it. And you also have to consider the significant brand impact that would have on the city and the region as a whole to have a major development like that sitting shuttered and locked. And then third, there are a number of important community events and engagement points that facility is critical for. So for all those reasons, we didn't really consider closing the door as a viable option, because ultimately now that the city has assumed responsibility as the sole shareholder, if that becomes a significant financial or other form of liability, that reverts back to the city anyways. So the asset's been developed, the investment's been made, but not everything has been done to make the best out of utilizing it and utilizing it in the best way. That's the path forward in our view.
Right. I don't know if you want to answer, but you know, in the course of this, and I think of Councillor Middleton Hope saying, has there been malfeasance over the last little while? You know, as far as what information we received was that wasn't necessarily legitimate. Is there, you know, how should we respond to that? Or is that something I shouldn't be asking at this time? Okay. Sure.
We're reviewing the findings very carefully,
Okay.
and we've retained expert assistance in terms of construction management, litigation firms to review the findings that they've had and explore
Okay,
what
so-
the next steps on the legal side should, if any, be.
I don't need to. I don't want to. If you don't feel comfortable with answering that, I mean, just one of those. Oh.
I'll weigh in on this. I was going to say it later, but I'll say it now. So this report's actually been turned over to the Economic Crime Unit of Lethbridge Police Service.
Okay.
So I can't comment further than that. You would have to direct questions to LPS.
Now, in terms of, you know, and I do, you know, information received when you vote on something, and that still goes to members of the exhibition board. So, you know, and not to throw any of them on the board under the bus, but they probably didn't receive the proper, information that they needed to make their decisions as well. It's the same as I feel City Council when we voted back in 20, whatever it was, to go ahead with the project without getting what, as we now know, is probably not all the information. So I guess that's more of a statement from my perspective, but it's also something that's very frustrating. Someone who's on a board and someone who is, making those decisions has to make.
We weren't able to verify whether all that information was made available to all the board members. Obviously, with council, we have the benefit of detailed transcripts and video records that allowed us to see exactly what was and wasn't presented in those forums. In absence of that, we weren't able to fully verify the same with respect to the LDE board. We just know that there was more detail and work than what was provided to City Council.
Sure. And one final question, just so I'm understanding, and maybe this goes to Mr. Matthews, is in terms of the maintenance that wasn't done, was the exhibition board responsible and in terms of getting it done and paying for it, or was the city? Was the city the third party that would do some of the maintenance at the exhibition? Just so I want to understand why, and then that also goes with, I know the grandstand is also in rough shape too. So how did that happen?
Thank you, Councillor Campbell, for that question. So in this regard, when it comes to the LDE specifically, there is a lease agreement that's between the City of Lethbridge and the Lethbridge District Exposition. Within that lease agreement, they would be responsible for any maintenance activities that were occurring. That was part of the responsibility of the exhibition. To your latter comment there, or question in regards to some of the other sites on that, yes, although those assets are the City of Lethbridge assets, being the rodeo and grounds and so forth, and that is responsibility of that group to maintain and manage through the Lethbridge District Exposition through a contract through them.
So that wasn't done, obviously, in the last.
Well, so when it comes to LDE side, I won't make comments right now on the other side yet because we haven't done any further work on that. But what it appears at this stage here is that that some of that work wasn't done on that, and that's some of the reasons why you see the pavilions where they are today.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Campbell. Councillor Dodick.
I just want to go back to the, I'll use your phrase, the third party. You said you did listen to the August 10, the audio and video recording of the presentation at that time, at which time the third party was present on the telephone. And I listened, like I said, I listened to it last night, and I was having a difficulty of getting a sense as to whether there was a singular report, a conclusion, a report that actually had a conclusion that made reference to a bunch of sub-reports and analysis that they did. But since you haven't, I assume you have not spoken with the third party to know exactly, was there a final, if I can call it that, a final report that just gathered everything together?
So without having spoken directly, from the reports and analysis we've received, there wasn't one final report that was a culmination of everything related to Agri-Food Hub, and specifically that model. There were some individual supporting reports that included different areas of analysis, such as analysis of potential revenue streams, analysis of estimates of the number of events that could potentially be held, other aspects of financial analysis that would have formed inputs into the model template that was provided.
Okay. My question is, then I have a question to the city solicitor. Presumably the third party was paid, contracted for by the then Lethbridge District Exhibition. I don't know if it would have been done through the board or whether it would have been done through the CEO, however they would have done that. So presumably now we are assignees of the rights and obligations and everything else, sometimes by choice and sometimes by operation of law. Are we able to request of the third party any and all communications that they had with the former board, together with any reports that they may have, whether complete or otherwise?
We've been making those requests for some time, and we're working through the responses at this time. Or yes, to be.
Thank you. That's what I was looking for. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Councillor Dodick. Councillor Schmidt-Rempel.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the presentation today. A couple of things I want to go back with, and I'm going to seek some more information from you. You spoke to the functional overlap with several organizations in Lethbridge. Obviously, an opportunity for us to be partnering with those organizations. Can you tell me more about this? Where do you see overlap within the city, not the corporate city, but the city of Lethbridge as so far as our partners go? Where do you see that overlap and with who?
Yeah, so the most specific and obvious examples that I would share, if you talk about event attraction and marketing, you think about the funding that is provided to Tourism Lethbridge and the role that they would potentially play in promoting and advocating. And you also think about the team that operates the NMAC Center, which has not only larger events in the arena itself, but it also has some small event space for corporate and other types of meetings as well. So so you think about it from an attraction perspective, all three of those are engaging in activities that have some involvement or alignment with the idea of promoting Lethbridge and bringing people to Lethbridge. And when you look at NMAC Center and LD, those are two really specific examples where we're actually managing events on the ground, bringing people in on the ground day to day. There are likely some other examples, but I share those for discussion today because they're very obvious and apparent.
Following up with that then, there's the suggestion we launch a new event attraction agency to drive community engagement. Where do you recommend that our organizations, the ones you just specifically mentioned, participate in launching that attraction agency?
Some of that would be to be determined in the design of what this long-term model would look like. So as mentioned, we do recommend that there be further analysis to validate some of these recommendations and to develop a more detailed view of what that structure, including the governance model, could look like. There are different ways this could be achieved. It could be achieved through bringing them into one organization, ostensibly a municipal controlled corporation, or it could be achieved in softer ways through various partnership agreements or collaboration agreements. So I think some of that is to be determined and will require further analysis.
Okay. You spoke to a community engagement plan. Tell me more about what you would recommend that looks like and what we should be engaging with the community on, knowing that we shouldn't be going out to engage for the sake of engagement. What are some thoughts about what we should be engaging the community on with regards to the report, with regards to the Agri-Food Hub?
Yeah, so
what does it look like there?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you're referring to our assessment of the current state for LDE, and we talked about how they didn't have a lot of formal processes around community sensing and engagement. So what we've found is that while they are seen by stakeholders as having positive impact on the community and being well integrated and engaged in the community, when you look at the actual processes and systems they have in place internally, it's fairly ad hoc or informal. So we see it as opportunities for them to further strengthen the alignment they have with community stakeholders. And, you know, good practice for any organization like this would be to have really strong understanding of what the community is actually seeking in terms of events, programs, and other activities that they provide, and doing that continual review to make sure, hey, are we investing in the right things to really maximize the impact that the citizens of Lethbridge and the visitors that we attract are feeling, are experiencing?
Okay, so you're not talking about one community engagement process, you're talking about many.
Ongoing, that's right.
Okay, thank you.
About sensing.
Okay.
Another question I have is we heard so often about information out there regarding information from the board, paperwork and everything from previous board, is that available to go through and disseminate, or has that disappeared?
As mentioned in the caveats, there were many restrictions on our ability to access information, especially when you think back to 2013. You think of, in that time period, the number of different board members, members of LDE management, city councilors, and city administrators who have been in place. There's obviously some loss of institutional knowledge going back that long, but part of it is when you look at the assessment, we see a lot of immature processes, right? And a common outcome of that is that things are not well documented and documents are not well retained. So that's certainly presented a challenge for us as we do that work. Now, we don't have any indication of evidence one way or the other that somebody intentionally went out and destroyed documents versus they just were never produced or never created or retained in that format. But what we do know is we couldn't access many of those things.
Thank you, because I've received multiple questions from community members asking, can you get this information that would be from a couple of years ago? And it's just, and I've tried to get said details, and I come to a wall all the time, and so it's tough if it's contracts that were signed, contracts that were re-signed, employment. There's so many different things there that I could never get answers to, and even with us having a member of the board now and it transferring over to our city manager, and I know, and maybe he can speak to it as well. From my understanding, he has struggled to get that same information. So when I look at these next steps, and you're talking about this, it's almost like you've wiped a slate clean per se. We found the results that you've brought forward and some of the recommendations, and that it makes it easier to move forward if we know what happened in the past, much easier. But apparently that's not. Answers to some of my questions will probably never be answered, I would imagine. Is that fair to say?
So while there were challenges in getting the information, we were able to access some of those contracts, some of those meeting minutes, some of those things. But it was certainly not complete access to everything that would have been available or existed at the time. It's probably fair to say that with the passage of time, it will be increasingly difficult to access some of those things. What I would say is that our procedures weren't fully exhaustive in that we didn't review every single thing available. And there are areas that could potentially be subject to further review, depending on guidance from council and administration. So there are some additional facts that could be uncovered. The question council and administration will have to continue to ask is the value for money or return on investment of some of those decisions, and where is it accretive, and where does it make sense to just move forward and focus on the future.
And last question that I have, for now, I'm hoping it's the last question for now, but you talked about going back sample sets of for example, the board and the CAO at the time, and 100% of the sample set did not follow policy or procedures. Did I hear that right? 100%?
For the CEO, it was 100%. For the board, I believe it was 50%. And that could be indicative of many things, but in general, they weren't following the processes in terms of the documented expense report, providing supporting receipts, providing supporting rationale for business purpose and things like that. So yes,
so 100, not one from the sample set, not even one?
Not one.
What is a sample set? Like, what would we say for a number one, a sample set? Is that
so for the CEO, we tested 35, and we found that 0 out of the 35 were fully compliant with the policy.
Thank you. Any further questions from my colleagues? All right. I do have, Madam City Clerk, I do have a couple motions coming from this, and I'm just wondering, we entertain the first one, I guess, the vice chair. Sure.
So we have a motion here from Mayor Higgin, Lethbridge and District Exhibition Phase 1 and third-party review, Deloitte LLP presentation. Be it resolved that the Economic and Finance Standing Policy Committee, 1, consider this report in conjunction with the next item 5.1.2, Administration's presentation, and 2, recommend that Council, in light of the high-level information discovered from the aforementioned third-party review, direct the City Manager to continue on with the review of the Lethbridge and District Exhibition by conducting subsequent reviews and/or a deeper dive review or deeper dive reviews to drill into select facets of concern deemed necessary by the City Manager with Council to determine the amount and source of funding at the December 10th, 2024 meeting of Council in conjunction with all other budget requests to be decided at that meeting.
I'll give you some background to why I have this motion as we're going through some of the next steps and the recommendations. I know that there was funding put aside for administration to dive into some of this work that needed to be done. My concern, I guess, and without having this, is the next steps may not happen if there's no staffing allocated to finishing up some of these steps. I was concerned when I heard it's being turned over to economic crimes unit like this. That's concerning, and so I want to make sure that if there's additional funding, as much as I'll tell you what, I don't like putting out dollars to continue going down certain paths, but this is one that I believe is of importance. I don't know what that funding amount is yet, and I know that Mr. CFO will come back to us with that information, but I think there's work still to be done, and we do need to continue this work and find out what is information is still available for us. I know the work that was done by yourselves, thank you very much. It gave us that broad view, but now I think we need to delve a little deeper into this information. And if I'm wrong, Mr. City Manager, is there more to do? Is there anything you could add to it? Is there additional work that needs to be done here?
It's loud today. Mr. Mayor, I think, keeping in mind that the report is very fresh, there's certainly potential areas that do need to be explored for deeper review, be it forensic audit or what have you. And we need to take this away and look at those carefully and determine next steps. And further to the comment, I can't comment on the economic crimes involvement, but we need to consider that as part of our process as we go forward.
Thank you.
Councillor Dodick?
I don't understand what 2 means.
Oh, wow. So just in light of all the information that we've received, that is very loud, received thus far, I just don't want this review to stop. And if the work from Deloitte is completed, I still believe there's more. If there's possibly other, and I'll put it just bluntly, other rocks to turn over and see if there's additional information that's going to save us in the future, being that if we don't do the review now, is it going to cost more later? So to continue some of the work that's been done thus far.
Well, then why not just put a period at the end of the word exhibition, because that'll allows him to do continued review, and then he can decide what the review is on, because the latter part of it says basically what the review is about. But more importantly, you put the period there, and then I'll understand what it means.
And I'm perfect with that. This is definitely on the fly here, putting this information together, but yeah, I'm fine with that. Less is more. You just didn't work with Councillor. Oh, you did work with Councillor Kaufman. You needed more than less, no? No. So we'll remove everything after.
On the grounds that the
exhibition.
answer might incriminate me, I refuse to answer.
So now, do we need,
You can live with that.
to determine the amount, that should still come back, I would imagine, determine the amount of the source of funding at December 10th. So we do have a date, we do need a date to come back and determine if there is funding required and what that source would come from. Is that fine if you read there now?
I was having some of the similar concerns of Councillor Dodick with this. And I'm wondering if we were wanting him to continue with the review or wanting him to come back with a plan to continue with the review. A plan that would have what's going to be reviewed and the costs, and have council make that decision. Because right now we're just saying go and do this, but we don't know what it would actually be entailing. I absolutely agree there's more to do, but I would like to be the ones who determine what that plan is rather than just leaving it open.
Thank you for that. And again, this was, you're crafting on the fly as you go, and I totally agree. That would work fine for me. As many friendlies coming here, I'm okay with moving forward with that. That's fine. So it would be a plan to continue with the review. Yeah.
Well, and the plan was having, you guys just need to review the word thinking, but I think we will. I don't know, we want to be clear, so. To continue on to review the Lebanon District exhibition, including determining the amount and source of funding. So if you keep the top and the bottom, just make it.
Including determining. Yeah.
Consider which report? This is this report. Huh?
Yeah. And I guess I'll look over to Mr. City Manager. The plan to come back, is this making sense to yourself and Mr. Matthews?
Yes, it makes sense. I think, when we come back, of course, it would be high level, the specifics to maintain the integrity of the process. We might not get into as much.
Mm-hmm. All right. I guess it's a plan, and it could be, that 20,000-foot plan, and council, as Councillor Crozan mentioned, can dive in deeper of what information we want to see at that time. So.
I have another thing. And my light is great. Yeah, I know, but mine's red.
Does December 10th give you enough time to put together a plan to come back?
Thank you, Councilor Schmidt-Rempel.
Lots of reds.
In regards to the planning timeframe, so as long as we're keeping it at the high level of objective kind of pieces, not any specifics, to give a bit of context of what this would be, yes, we could do that. And here again, to the more specific sides, we wouldn't be able to provide, as Mr. Barley said, just because of the nature of some of the reviews that could come out of it.
Okay. Councillor Dodick?
Yeah, paragraph 1, consider this report. I think just so what happens a lot of times afterwards when we pull things out, so we say, what report? So I would suggest that number 1, say, consider the November 26, 2024 Deloitte council briefing, because that's what it's called.
Perfect. All of these are very friendly. I like them.
It doesn't say MNP.
Right.
Okay, and those, Mayor Hagan, you consider as all friendlies? Any concerns on your end with any of them?
Nope, that looks great. Oh.
Councillor Dodick?
Sure, how about thanking them for their presentation too?
You want to include that? Is that a friendly amendment?
Oh, a lot of times we say we'd like to thank them for their presentation, no?
I was going to throw it out there verbally, but you know what? This is even more gutter, right?
Yep. Council, okay. All right. Any other changes, questions, comments? Councillor Carlson? No? All right. So Councillor Higgins, to open for debate?
I think pretty much everything has been said. I just appreciate council support and hope we continue moving forward with this and digging even deeper to what the unfortunate things we found and hopefully there's a path forward with, again, the information that was received thus far. But I think it's important that we continue the work.
All right. I see no one else in for debate, so I will call for the vote. All in favor? That carries. Thank you.
I do have a resolution from Councillor Crowson and Acting Mayor Carlson, enhancements to policies and procedures regarding financial risk. Motion arising, be it resolved that Economic and Finance Standing Policy Committee recommend to City Council that administration be directed to amend City of Lethbridge policies and procedures as needed to better protect the corporation and Lethbridge taxpayers in the future from undue financial risk in accordance with the following objectives. Number one, to ensure the City of Lethbridge does not finance, backstop, or otherwise guarantee any borrowing by or on behalf of any community organization to fund their projects. Number two, to better assess and address capital and life cycle funding requirements for city-owned facilities that are operated by community organizations under leases and other types of agreements. Number three, to better ensure accountability and transparency for municipal funding provided to community organizations for capital projects. And number four, to better ensure administrative due diligence on operating agreements with community organizations and grants awarded by the City of Lethbridge by A, establishing requirements for operational performance reporting, financial reporting, and or project deliverable reporting by funding recipients throughout the funding period based on program or minimum dollar thresholds. And B, establishing clear conditions and guidelines for eligible and ineligible expenditures or funding. C, conducting periodic reviews and cost-benefit analysis of funding provided to community organizations or other third-party service providers. And number five, to foster stronger governance of community organizations by exploring and recommending minimum standards for community boards such as training and professional development on governance that could be established as conditions that must be met for community organizations to qualify for larger funding agreements or capital projects. And further be resolved that administration develop a recommended implementation plan and service and schedule for these policy and procedure amendments for consideration by the Economic and Finance Standing Policy Committee before the end of Q1 2025. Councillor Crowson and Acting Mayor Carlson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll check with my colleague. Councillor Crowson, did you want to open?
Why don't you open? Because you're online, it's just easier to open sometimes.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mayor and colleagues. Appreciate that this is very timely. I know we've just received the Deloitte report, and through the presentation, we did hear lots of recommendations on how council and our administration could do a better job at protecting ourselves and our community's interests. So in the over the last few months, Councillor Crowson and I have been working with the city manager and his team to look at some ways we could be better prepared for things coming down the pipe in future. And so the 4 items in front of you could just be a starting point. There may be others now that we've heard the full Deloitte report that council wants to pursue. But we think that these amendments, and I don't want to just say they could just be amendments, they may be creation of new policy altogether. But hopefully, with the creation of these items that are in front of us today for your consideration, we're hopeful that our council and our community could avoid some missteps or mistakes going forward that have been fairly costly to the community. So they're here for your review and any comments or questions you may have. But with that, I'd open it up for any questions unless Councillor Crowson has some comments.
Making a couple. I don't think anyone is surprised that I think everything starts with good policies and procedures. And then you have to follow them and make sure we actually go through with them. The one thing I want to focus on is number 5 with the governance of community boards. It's one of the concerns, not just from the LDE stuff, but there's been other organizations we have seen in this area as well. And better training in board governance is something we need across the board. It's something that's always going to be ongoing, but ensuring that there's professional development for boards, that they have the skills matrix, that they are prepared if there is anything like a capital budget or anything like that, that they have strong audit committees, that they have strong policies, particularly for those groups that we fund. In many cases, this is there, but we have seen it with organizations when they grow or when things change, that governance is not always there. And we also saw today that ensuring they have proper record keeping and retention policies would absolutely be part of this. This isn't just coming out of the LDE. Some of these thoughts that Councillor Carlson and I put together with the help of administration aren't just coming from an LDE. There have been other things over the past decade, 2 decades, where some of this would have been incredibly useful. And one of the things we have to ensure is that we learn from, things that happen and bring in the best possible policies. And so I hope my colleagues will support this. As Councillor Carlson said, this may not be all conclusive. So if there are other things that you see should be added, or as we go through the process, because this isn't going to be done immediately, as we go through the process, if it can be fine-tuned, that would be wonderful. But I think we have here a starting point, and I hope my colleagues will support this and ask the questions that they have regarding it.
I see no questions in the queue. That was very well explained, obviously. Thank you, Councillor Carlson and Councillor Crowson. With that close, I think you pretty much opened and closed there. All right. We'll call the question. Question's been called. All in favor? And that is unanimous. Thank you. And we will recess this meeting until tomorrow, and council will start up shortly after lunchtime. So then the economic and finance will continue tomorrow, and that will be 5.1.2. Yes, and questions, etc., from the public as well. So that will happen tomorrow. Thank you.